Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of TBR. And I'm George Binns, and we have as our guest this evening Jack Quigley as the return engagement. And as you recall, we had a discussion a while back about who we are and where we came from based on essentially a book and a video by Spencer Wells. And it's The Journey of Man, and before the people who are politically correct get their knickers in a twist, The Journey of Man is really a DNA study about the Y chromosome that only men have. And during the video, Spencer mentioned a couple of times, and the men didn't travel alone, so made it okay. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you, George, and thank you very much for inviting me back. I appreciate it, and I'm also interested to hear that you have a personal interest in anthropology as well.
Oh, yeah.
And you have a good background, so.
Well, it was one of these things that one of my first retirement projects was teaching science and math in the K through 8 school, and about that time, everybody discovered DNA. Well, not everybody. I guess Watson and Crick took all the credit and didn't give Rosalind Franklin any credit for doing the X-ray that they read, but that gets you interested into it, and I guess one of the things you get into is you're an anthropologist, and you're in the game of, we got these old bones and we got these old artifacts, and what do they tell us about who did what to who and when? And it got to be kind of a muddy story, and from my perspective, once you get DNA and once you learn how to extract DNA from some of these old bones, the story gets to be a little different. And I guess that's essentially what Spencer Wells did when he was going around taking DNA samples of men and checking for errors or differences in the Y chromosome, and he traced the Out of Africa story. And it starts off with the Sand People. And if you could put up picture number 1, please. That is the Sand People, or sometimes referred to as Sand Bushmen. And they're our oldest living relatives. They're still hanging around in the Kalahari in Africa, and that's where it all started. And that's where you brought in the story, I guess.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you. And it's really good to hear how much you know and you care about it, because it's the story of our life. It's the story of the human beings. And no one was sure what the details were using the older form of trying to guesstimate using bones and things, because they do lose their power to inform you. But this particular biogeneticist, Spencer Wells, was 33 when he made this trip. And he made this trip, and he called it The Journey of Man, which is, and it was a PBS home video. And it's the most important piece of information I ever had in all the years of teaching anthropology, although I only had it for the second part, about 12 years. And I can tell you, as I just mentioned to George before we started, that I had hundreds of students and possibly 25, 30 classes, counting all the semesters and the summers. And every class I can remember, someone would come up to me, or a few people would come up to me and say, when this finished and when we finished, why didn't we know this before? And it's a question that's become very, very important to me, and it's one that has motivated me and makes me very pleased to be able to be on this show, because I'd like people to get a hold of this Journey of Man, home video, PBS, in the best way you can. You can buy it. You can also get some free copies. But I asked George during my last show, I want to do an overview of this, because this, as I said, is the most important part of my class that I ever had, because it makes the case clearly, and as he said in the second book he wrote, which I'm going to make a reference to, the facts now are irrefutable. before there was sort of questioning. Anthropologists always kind of question each other about this and that, and the dates are not specific. We're not talking about knowing it was 246,000, in springtime. They simply can't do things like that. But it's not necessary, because DNA now, as George knows, and as we'll get into a little bit with some of the info I have, you can be very specific about the DNA that you're looking at, and it was used to talk about the trip that was actually made. It was made out of Africa. It begins with this particular group called Homo sapien, and some of the anthropologists actually call the group left Homo sapiens sapien, and it really means man, wise man. And the two sapiens indicated there was a bit of a bump, and the people, when they left, had a ability to communicate with each other. They had ability to talk to each other. They had ability to pass ideas, and he feels it gave them the power to do things they needed to do to make this fantastic journey. And I just want to read the back of here, because it's a synthesis, and then I'll talk about some of the stops they make, and I'll finish in just a couple of minutes, hopefully. Journey of Man answers the question, where do we all come from? All come from. Today, some 6 billion, this is old, so now it's about 7 billion people are spread across the planet. But there was a time not so long ago when the human species numbered only a few thousand people, and this is incredible, but true. And their world was a single continent, Africa. Then something happened. The something that happened is small groups, probably climate change driven, that's been moving people for a long time, moved them out of where they were. A small groups of people, no more than 20 or 30 people, moving out and going out of Africa and crossing into East Asia. This probably started, other groups had gone out, earlier groups, and became extinct. But this is Homo sapien sapien. This is us. This is all of us, all the people in the world now. And they started out approximately 60,000 years ago. And they left Africa and they went over to East Asia, and they went from East Asia to the west part of Asia. They became China, Japan. They moved up into the north area. The north area is Afghanistan, or rather, not Afghanistan, Kazakhstan. And these are places that Wells visited. And what he was doing at each of these stops, he was taking blood from people. And in the blood is something called DNA. I could leave it like that, but it's deoxyribonucleic acid. So now you know.
Yeah.
But it's DNA, and it's when you see the numbers. I'm going to talk with George a little bit in the third section or the second section about the numbers. As I mentioned before, they're incredible. They're hard to believe how we are made. But this DNA goes from father to son, and that's why it became the name of the book, because there certainly were women and there certainly were children who went too. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here.
Yeah.
So
well, really, what you're talking about, there were two separate excursions out of Africa. One was in the 70,000-year-old time frame in the middle of the last glaciation period, and they took the southern route along what's now the coast of India, and eventually got to Australia and became the Aborigines. And then there was the second group that left maybe 40,000 years ago, and they went north through the Levant, which is now Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, made a right turn and ended up in Kazakhstan, and hung around there for 10,000 years. And then they split again, and some went east, some went west. And the ones that went west are the Europeans, and the ones that went east became Chinese. The part I'm missing is, where did the Indians come from? Were they out of the first group, or were they?
Yes. The Indian, the story I have, and the story that Wells uses, is the first. There were groups that left, and Homo erectus, the Homo that started, they became extinct, but they went out into East Asia and to a little bit into the European areas. They find bodies in there that are Homo erectus. The first one, Homo habilis, which is about 2 million years ago, but their sapiens as well, Homo habilis, they disappeared too.
Yeah.
And they had, you'll see when you look at some of the information I gave you, smaller brains. So I think it was the brain size of the last group, Homo sapien, and again sapien sapien, that gave us the ability to communicate with each other and to really makes the difference to be successful.
Yeah.
There was another group, a first group of Homo sapien that really was also called Neanderthal, and they left about 50,000 years ago. They probably showed up about, the guesstimate is 1,200,000, 1,300,000. They made it up into Europe and into a little bit of East Asia, West Asia, excuse me. But they were extinct when Homo sapiens, our group, actually came and found them. And there are some people that did integrate with them, and so there is a small part of the population that has Neanderthal genes.
Yeah.
And this again is they can tell everything about your genetic setup.
Yeah. The point you're making is that when our Homo sapiens sapien ancestors got to Europe, they bred with the Neanderthals that were there, and you and I and everybody else that came out of Europe, it's got about 4% of our DNA is Neanderthal. But you go the other way, and you're starting to pick up Denisovian genes. So the story gets a little bit confusing at times as to who's related to who and who did what to who. And you get to the Southeast Asians, the Pacific Islanders, and there's an awful lot of Denisovian DNA in their system. So a lot of stuff was going on. And the story is not over yet. I mean, they're still working on it, and they're getting smarter and understanding better and better where we all came from. But it comes down to the same thing. We're all the same kind of people.
Well, that's the prime point, and that's the point why I'm trying to do this again. The story is every human being on Earth, no matter where you live, is 99.9% the same DNA. We're almost identical. And that's the point that I hope to make, and I hope to have the public think about, because that makes one of the major differences in our society and our life. We're not talking about race because race is a social construction. It was made up. However, racism was not made up. Racism happened, but it was because people were thought to be different. This is proof that we're not different. We're the same group. We moved to different climates, different areas of the world, and we changed. And we'll be talking about that a little bit. The big push that I like, and the one I'm going to just focus on before I keep moving, is the one up in Kazakhstan, because it was the same people that came out. They stayed there for about 20,000 years, and you had people leaving from Kazakhstan, and possibly it was the reason why they did leave. One group, as you said, went to Europe and basically becomes Europeans. The other group goes north, that I'm talking about, and they become Siberians. They went into northern Siberia, and they lived there, and they're
still living there, yeah.
Yes, it's almost all over. They hunt and actually keep reindeer.
Yeah, the reindeer herders.
Yes, and they're dark-skinned, and the interesting thing about this particular group, the most interesting thing, is they crossed over. They crossed over about 15,000 years ago over the peninsula, Beringia, over the peninsula, connected into Alaska, crossed down through Alaska, again, probably on the coast, and went from Alaska all the way down to the end of South America. Now, this is beyond belief almost, but it really happened. So everybody, and including Native Americans, it's part of the same group. And I personally like that, because Native Americans, and in my initial interest as a young man in Native Americans got me interested in anthropology. So finding out the relationship there you'll find out when you see the Journey of Man that the last stop that Spencer Wells makes is with the Navajos. It's the same group. It's the group that came out of Africa, period. And they were amazed by what Spencer Wells, the pictures he was showing them of people from the San Bushmen and other kinds, and saying, that looks like Uncle Harry, and this one looks like Aunt Maggie. And it was an interesting story. But the bottom line, once again, and I just want to just quickly tell his stops. He goes to the Bushmen first. He goes to the African sand. He goes to India. He goes back from Australia up to India to find the same blood to make sure that they made this coastal trip, and he finds it. And of course, down in Australia, they're the same people. They changed, they turned, and they don't think that they're connected to Africa. He was talking to people from Australia, and they say, no, we have the Australian song line, and this tells us where we come from, out of the water or someplace like that. So, but in any case, every single group of people you see, whether they look different or not, are 99.9% the same. We're the same species. We are one global species, and I really hope we can get to the point where we can understand that, because we have climate change coming up again, and it's going to be massive. It's going to be difficult. We won't be here, but our children and our grandchildren will be here. And if we could come together on this problem as a global species, instead of arguing with each other as certain kinds of races, we might be able to get it done. And I'm hopeful that we can get it together as a national, a global unity to work on this climate change together. Some of the other stops, and then I'll move on. Cro-Magnon in France. Cro-Magnon in France, Europeans that went there, these are the people that ended up painting some of the caves. And you could see by what they were doing, we were prepared. We were prepared to paint our story, to talk about communicating with people with art. This has never been done anywhere before, but this is the same group. And the Central Asian group, again, goes to Europe and goes up to Siberia and goes down, of course, to Alaska and down all the way to South America. It's stunning. That's the story of Journey of Man.
The other thing that needs to, I think, recognize is, again, I keep harping on this concept that it's not a finished story yet. And what's getting people somewhat confused is, the theory is that they crossed over the Bering Straits when it was low country and the tide was out. And by the way, the tide was out 400 feet plus when the glaciers sucked up all the water. And that was supposedly 15,000 years ago. Except they find camps in South America where people were living 17,000 years ago. They just found a set of footprints in New Mexico that were dated to 23,000 years ago. So the story is still unfolding. And turns out we were, way back when, very imaginative people and very resourceful to get around the glaciers that were in the middle of this last glaciation period.
Yes. Yes, that's a normal part of anthropology. You can tell the story when you have the facts, but when new facts come in, you have to change the story.
Exactly.
And everybody's quite willing to do that.
Yeah.
But the story is really building in terms of who went where when. But it's the same basic. We started in Africa. We all started the same. I wanted to move a little bit to your second because I think I made my point. I hope everybody gets a look at this. But the second thing I wanted to check with is one of the better explanations, and it's something I picked up. I have two of these. I just want to show you a few pages. This was called the smallest ever guide to life sciences for busy people, and it was somewhere in New England. I went to a college and they had this. I just want to turn to a couple of pages and we'll get some ideas of what we were talking about. The first one is on page 3. It's talking about eye color. And eye color is again, half our genes come from our mother and half come from our father. In this case, they make a case for selection. Both the father and the mother have brown eyes. Brown eye is a color that's dominant. So all have brown eyes, but it doesn't mean they don't have an allele, a second DNA piece for eye. So once every 4 childs, you get a blue-eyed child. It's just sort of how genes select. This is one of the ways. there's a little story about Darwin on page 4. He was quite correct in his assertions, even though he had no way to know what was going on. But he did, in his book Origin of Species, he did make some cases that turned out still to be true. The forms change. This is his, back in 1860 something. The forms change depending on ecological conditions. 2, due to natural selection, that's his big point. The fittest are more likely to survive. If you have a physical change and the physical change adds to your lifespan, you're more likely to reproduce with that natural selection.
Yeah.
And as you see, something like the opposable thumb was naturally selected, and it gave us a massive advantage in terms of hunting and making things. Eye color, we can see color out in the world. That gave us an advantage. Hearing gave us an advantage. And certainly brain size gave us an advantage. And every one of those advantages were passed on literally by people who survived long enough to reproduce.
Yeah. And I think one of the things you start to get into is the variation within an area is much more difficult. If you could put up picture number 2, please. This is another native of Africa. And if you remember back to the picture of the Sand People, a significant difference in the amount of melanin in her skin compared to the other one. And that's really the ecological change or the environmental adaptations, a lot of names for it, that depending upon where you're living, you have to adjust to it or you don't survive. And could you put up picture number 3, please? That's the fun one. That is a reproduction of what people think an Irishman from about 6,000 years ago looked like. And the story, I love it, is that they were working on a pub in England, not in England, Northern Ireland, and they found a skeleton beneath the basement, and it wasn't Jimmy Hoffa. And when they did some analysis on it, it was 6,000 years old. They checked the DNA, and this particular gentleman had haplotype group 5. And there's a whole lot of other numbers that go with it. But basically what the DNA said is he had dark skin, he was lactose intolerant, and he had blue eyes. And there's a quote I got from the National Museum of Ireland and Trinity College that essentially said, first Irish people had dark to black skin, similar to the Cheddar Man in England. So this is an ongoing story. We think ancient Irish population would be similar. The current very light skin that we have in Ireland now is an endpoint of thousands of years of surviving in a climate where there is very little sun. So this whole idea of white skin is something we came back to very recently. And the other part of the story you started to mention about the dark skin of the Siberians and the Inuits, Eskimos or whatever you know them as, also have dark skin. So part of the adaptation is if you're living on just animal food alone, because there are no crops grown in Siberia or in Alaska or northern Canada, you eat the whole animal and you get the organ meat. That's where you get your vitamin D from. So it's an alternative that we adapted to so that can maintain dark skin, but you can still get your DNA.
Yes,
Vitamin D.
Yes, that's correct. There's also something relevant to the climate the reindeer herders are in, and the sun's bouncing off the snow and bouncing off the ice that makes it okay for them to have the dark skin.
Yeah. So anyway, we're getting down to the 5-minute mark. We've had a lot of fun.
5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
right.
Basically, you wanted to talk...
May I just wrap it up with the second book by Spencer Wells was written 10 years later, called Pandora's Seed, and I can wrap that story up as quick as I can. He's not writing about people leaving Africa. He's talking about hunting and gathering people. Hunting and gathering people were the people that actually left. That's what everybody did. When the hunting and gathering people got to about 10,000 years ago, they ran into farming. And farming became overwhelmed what they were doing. Everybody became farmers. And the farming changed the society. It changed the society into all the way up to essentially what we have now. You had farming and you had feudalism and you had large people that owned land, important people owned land. You had an industrial period when capitalism came in. You have a period now when we're in a relatively ongoing difficult situation in terms of wealth and poverty. We have a situation where something like 490 people own more wealth than 190 million people. That's where we are now. And that's the end point of this particular book. He's talking about societies becoming less about me and mine and more about caring and sharing. And caring and sharing defines the way hunters and gatherers lived. They shared with each other, they cared for each other. So he's looking for a society that will build those kinds of values in the society, caring and sharing for each other.
Okay, so I think we're getting to the point of we need to have another show because there's so much more to keep talking about. And one of the other things I picked up in doing research to catch up with you is you start to think about people with large armies and dynasties that developed great wealth, and they just got overrun by the next group that got better. And you eventually get to the point, however, in Northern Europe, something different happened where all of a sudden the Industrial Revolution took off. So that's the place where I want to start on the next time. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And as I've indicated, we're going to have some more discussion about this because this whole issue about the social construct called race is something that irks me quite a bit because it's a fabrication. And how do you make a fabrication go away? So stay tuned. And again, if you've got some comments, you want to join the discussion, my email address shows up in the credits. Send me an email and there's room for you at the table. Thanks again, ladies and gentlemen. And stay tuned. We'll be back.